what I would like to do today is I looked, of course, at the program of the Dependency Studies Center, and I think it's where I will try to fit in is precisely the issue of forms of dependency and subalternity which are somehow not visible or hidden behind ideological and also material structures. So going beyond the structure of slavery on the one hand and freedom on the other, and looking at all that which is in between. And since the idea of slavery is very much based and subalternity on antiquity, I think this is also very interesting for us today to understand how the legacy of this still somehow shapes the discourse about subalternity. And so my thesis is that in classical antiquity, what happens in the classical period, so that would be the 5th and 4th centuries BC, is a separation on an ideological level between politics on the one hand and economy on the other. And in this is fundamental are figures, of course, like Aristotle and Plato, also some others, who first theorize the idea of something like an economic sector, an economic knowledge, an economic discourse which is separated from that of political rights and political inclusion and participation. And in my book, which I have written as an outcome of this research, also fieldwork in southern Italy, what I'm trying to argue is that these ideas, which have had then an enormous impact on the formation of knowledge and of disciplines, so that is today it's quite normal to address issues of economic participation and exploitation and rights separately from the political sphere, is also an outcome of these writers. And these writers, Plato, Aristotle mainly, lived and thought and wrote in a period which was profoundly characterized by colonization. Colonization not in the modern sense, but neither in a totally different mode from modern colonizations. So the 5th and 4th centuries witness the foundation of colonies, often in areas which are not Greek settled. So there's contacts and also tensions with non-Greek local populations. And behind this, there's also a history of social tension and diversity in the homeland, in the metropolis, because often those who go to the colonies are themselves somehow subaltern or in a difficult position, some often actually forced to go as a result of political strife, civil strife, or economic difficulties. And so there are numerous levels of dependency and subalternity, which then create a specific colonial situation, which is then, I think, very influential on the level of theory. So what I would like to do is to show you this and to argue this, parting from a case study, which is Heraclea in southern Italy. This is the book I talked about, which I will draw on mainly in this lecture. This is kind of to show the common idea of the classical period. That would be the flourishing period of classical Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries BC is very much based on mainland Greece urban culture. So you see here the Parthenon and the Apollo in the Belvedere, which is a Roman copy of a Greek statue from the 4th century BC. And this, of course, has shaped our idea of the classical period. We are not so much used to think of it as a period of colonization, also because colonization in ancient Greece, so that will be the foundation of new settlements in other non-Greek territories mainly, sometimes also in Greece itself, is often seen as a phenomenon of the previous archaic period, so from the 8th to the 6th centuries BC. And this is just one example from you could take basically any handbook or most handbooks and dictionaries and summaries, and you will often find colonization in classical Greece as represented as something belonging to the archaic period. Actually, it's somehow misleading to think this way. There are many colonies also founded in the classical period, so the phenomenon continues, and this means that many citizens of the time, or people living in that time, including people like Plato and Aristotle, had direct experience of colonization. Aristotle wrote an essay or a dissertation on how to found colonies. The works of Plato are full of the new city, the idea of founding a new city, based on a rough estimate in Athens in the late 5th century BC, taking into account both colonies, which the Greeks called apoikiai, so foundations, settlements away from home, apo, oikia, and so-called kleroches. Kleroches, that would be a different form, a slightly different form of colony. So if you take only what we know from the written sources, during the late 5th century, about 4,000 to 5,000 Athenian citizens were actively involved in colonization, and this amounts to about 20% or even more of the population, the citizen population of Athens at that time. So this gives an idea of the importance of the phenomenon during the classical period. And one of these colonies is Heraclea, founded in 433-32 BC by Tarentum, another colony, another old colony city in southern Italy, on the spot of a old destroyed city, which was also a colony named Ceres. So it's a recolonization, and it's interesting because it shows the idea, the model of a city and its hinterland in the classical period, which was refounded and redeveloped from scratch. The old city of Ceres had been destroyed around 560 BC. Then there's a period in which there is only a very scarce settlement in the area, probably people from neighboring settlements and indigenous populations coming, so to speak, back to the area. And then we have this new urbanization, because colonization is also linked with urbanization in the 5th century BC. And what I tried to do is to take inspiration from post-colonial and critical studies, and especially from the idea that the apparent marginality of the colonies, and especially of the rural populations. This is a central issue also in the so-called post-colonial studies group in Southern Asian scholars working mainly on India and Bangladesh. We see the book of by Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, all very much based on the seminal work of Edward Said, Orientalism. So the idea that what seems marginal and kind of secondary actually tells us something about the core of, in this case, European culture. So the idea of the Orient as a projection, as a ideological construct that serves to build a European identity. And so I'm trying to take this input, bring it into the field of classical Greek colonization. I also was very much inspired by other archaeologists working in this direction, and I will show here some, I think, very important publications of the last years. So there's a new movement or new tendency in archaeology also to reconsider these areas, rural areas, rural landscapes here in the Punic world in this case, and also the idea of the colonized, so who lived in these landscapes, and how does the history of these people contribute or could contribute to our understanding of classical Greece. So here we see the area where we carried out our research. So we have again Tarentum and the colony of Heraclea, formerly Ceres. And what we did was carrying out a field survey. So that means we looked at what was to be seen on the surface finds. Then we started also an excavation in the urban center together with Massimo Sanna from the University of Basilicata and Stéphane Verger from Paris. And so we had the opportunity to compare what happens in the landscape, in the countryside, and what happens in the urban center. So this is the basis of what I would like to talk about today. And the whole subject issues very much, I would say biased maybe, or shaped, characterized by scholarship of the post-war area, and especially by Wolfram Höpfner and Lutz Schwantner's book on house and city in classical Greece, where they tried to reconstruct first the material structure of these new foundations, in this case mainly refoundations or reorganizations of extant cities, and to find out what's the relationship between these newly established cities and the ideological form, the structure of the society behind them. And the idea here is that ideas like democracy and equality shaped the form of these cities. We see here the example of Praini in Western Anatolia, where we have a very rigid urban layout, and what they argued was that also the houses are organized according to a standardized pattern. So everybody has the same allotment to build a house, but also the houses themselves are all more or less equal. And this is then interpreted as a typically democratic form of settlement. This has been put in question many times, especially because there are also settlements which are organized in this way, which are definitely not democratic, and also because the idea that these houses were actually all similar is not really founded on sound archaeological evidence, so it's kind of questionable. But I think it was a very important contribution nonetheless, not least because of the wonderful drawings. I don't say this in jest, it's really, I think it's important also in archaeology to imagine and to think about material evidence in terms of visual representation. So this is the idea of the so-called Typenhäuser, type houses. Everybody's equal, so everybody lives in similar houses. Our excavations in Heraclea showed two things. On the one hand, the remains of houses that can still be seen on the site, which is divided into several areas, the so-called plateau, Castello Hill, which is elevated, some kind of acropolis according to some. Then there's a valley in the middle dividing the urban space, and then there's the so-called South Plateau, which was also built up. And the remains of houses that can be seen there actually show a regular pattern. So you see here on the left that there are regular divisions of the urban space. So this seems to support the idea that there was some kind of standardized subdivision of the urban space, which is also very much suggested by the Greek term for these lots, which is kleros, so the lot which you take and which probably were, of course, more or less equal. And so this is one. The other is, however, that when we looked at these structures more closely, what we found out is that the more or less regular shape is rather a late phenomenon. And the more you go back in time, so this would be the last period which can be read in the archaeological evidence, so Hellenistic period, 3rd to 1st, 2nd century BC. If you go back in time, it actually becomes more irregular. So this is somehow contradicts the idea that this whole structure of the city goes back to an initial moment where the colonists arrived and everybody got the same lot size to build a house. It actually seems that the initial phases were rather scarce and scanty structures and do not respect any formalized and standardized house plot. And actually, if we think about it, it's also somehow logical. Excavations on the site of Velia have shown that the earliest buildings, habitations in this site were huts or wooden structures of which only the post holes remain. So you see here, it's a very difficult task, archaeologists, to reconstruct these early structures from materials which are not easily conserved in the ground. Velia was founded in the late 6th century BC, but it's important because it helps us to understand why it's often so difficult to really find the traces of the earliest settlement phases, which is not really due to an absence of people living in these places, but simply to the fact that they started on a very low level in terms of building techniques and structures. And there's also an interesting passage in an ancient author, Xenophon, who writes about colonization and the idea to found a new city, and it's all starts with tents. So people building tents on the seashore, and this is kind of the beginning, we have to imagine, for probably most colonies. So very simple forms of settlement. And so here's just an idea. It's not that in modern times, when there were much more elaborate technical possibilities, things were so different. So still in the 19th and early 20th century, new settlements in Northern America and also in other parts of the world, in also colonial environments, started often with tents and wooden buildings. So we have, on the one hand, this very modest beginnings. On the other hand, what we see is that these settlements in Heraclea, but also elsewhere, were fortified from early on. So there's a structure, very large fortification wall, which amounts to 140 hectares, so a huge area, which was urbanized and laid out from early on. We don't know if it was actually settled and built up in its entirety, probably not, but at least there was an idea of building a large settlement where most of the people, if not all, could live in the fortified urban center. And we should contrast this with what happens in the countryside. We started the field survey with the idea of studying, of course, all archaeological periods as usual, but with a specific question. So how can we read classical colonization in the countryside? And the result was that it was also almost totally absent. So there were no farmsteads, habitation sites in the first 100 years or so of the settlement. There were, however, cult places, so there was ritual activity going on. You see these two white rectangles. These are early cult places which were in use, and which somehow show that the city, the polis, took an interest in the countryside and marked its claim on the land through sacred places. Then you see a number of probably habitation sites, which is always, of course, an interpretation based on surface finds, where we have a very low number, 1 to 2 classical pottery sherds, and the rest is early Hellenistic, so from around 330 BC onward, and that means about 100 years after the foundation of the urban center of Heraclea. So how can we explain this? Here's again, this is the same data in a histogram. So as comparison, we see here what's happening in Metapontum, which is the neighbor city. So you have sites per square kilometer, and there's a relatively constant number. And then you see the foundation of Heraclea, and it remains really low, and then it starts growing significantly only in the second half of the 4th century BC. And it's even more drastic, the development, if we look at the rural necropolis, which are very important because if there's there are tombs in the countryside, it means that people lived there on a stable basis, and that what we see there in terms of houses and structures is not simply something that people living in the city built and used temporarily, but there were really real rural communities who buried their members in the countryside. So this corroborates the idea that we have a very low, extremely low, almost absence, based on the survey data, rural settlement in the early phase. And this is in line somehow with what we can deduce from the written sources, especially inscriptions, foundation decrees, and also historical sources. And I show here the so-called foundation decree of Corcyra Melina, settlement of the late 4th, early 3rd century BC in the Adriatic Sea. And it's almost totally unknown on the level of archaeology, but what has survived is this wonderful and extremely important inscription, which talks about the first settlers. And you see there's a list of these people, a few hundreds, and then there's a text where it talks about what everybody has to do and what everybody gets in turn, who participates in this colonization. And people, there's much emphasis on building a fortified settlement. Fortified because apparently there were tensions with the local population. And everybody gets a piece of land inside the fortified center to build a house, and a piece of land in the countryside. So the main focus is on agriculture. People were living in the urban center and cultivating their land lots in the surrounding area. And so this is what Max Weber called the Ackerbürger Polis, so a community of people, of agriculturists living in a fortified center. And what this means in terms of organization of the countryside can be seen, for example, in Chersonesus on the Crimea Peninsula, on the Black Sea. So we have the settlement center, and then the land lots, where in this case, the organization of the landscape still can be seen today. And it was roads, streets, and small rubble walls that divided equal or less equal-sized land lots. The same holds true for Pharos, another colony in the Adriatic. There's also still visible in aerial photographs the urban center and the division of the land among the settlers. And so we have to imagine probably something similar here. People living in Heraclea and dividing the land among themselves to cultivate it. And the problem obviously is if you get a piece of land in the vicinity of the urban center, you're lucky. If it's far away, it gets difficult because you have to walk 2, 3, up to 4 hours to get to your piece of land. And we made a theoretical, of course, calculation. The urban space of Heraclea would have offered place for up to about 17,000 people living there. And the carrying capacity, so the capacity of the land to feed a certain number of people in this area here, which is bordered by the rural sanctuaries and which probably was the extension of the territory of Heraclea, amounts about to the same number, so 18,000 people. So this means there is could be a model here. You have a countryside offering the livelihood for about 15 to 20,000 people, and an urban center which offers space for all these people. And so the model is that which Max Weber described as an Ackerbürger polis. And then this begins to change, as I said before, about 100 years after the foundation of the city. And we see now a very dense population of the hinterland, of the countryside, many tombs also, small buildings, villages, farmsteads, isolated farmsteads, and this is here the area around Heraclea. And the same happens in the inland, where you have non-Greek settlements, which are organized around another central place, which is Monte Coppola. So it's a common phenomenon in this period, and it kind of breaks up the original model of the settlement. And so what I would like to do now, in order to also get toward the conclusion of my talk, is to ask, what does this mean on the level of social hierarchies and subalternity? It's important to mention here that in the same period, when we see this diversification between an urban population and a rural population who live in the countryside for the first time, there's also evidence of artisanal production going on in this city. This type of activity is almost totally absent in the during the early generations. So we really have almost no evidence of pottery production and other metal working during the first 100 years or so of the colony, which means that probably they depended very much on imports from the mother city, first of all, Tarentum, but also from Metapontum and Turi. And actually, painted pottery found in Heraclea, in some cases, certainly comes from Metapontum, because the pottery kilns where these vases were made have been excavated, so we can demonstrate this, which means that we have a very directed economy in the first years, which is almost entirely focused on agriculture. The idea then is also that being a citizen means living in the urban center, and there's a whole lot of ancient written sources more or less saying this explicitly. So, of course, you can live in the countryside and you can still have the right to go to the assembly of the people, what the Athenians celebrated, obviously, and also other cities in Heraclea. This was called the Halia, so the meeting of the people to decide, to take decisions. But the whole situation, the whole condition of participating in the ecclesia, the assembly of the citizens, were totally different if you lived in the countryside. I think there has been too much focus on the institutions, but if you look also at ancient sources, the countryman farmer who comes to the assembly is depicted as someone who can vote, of course, and participate, but he is not depicted as someone who can actively shape the course of things, because they don't participate in the symposia, in the banquets, in the hetairai, the meetings. They can't go to the palestra on a daily basis. So they are officially citizens, but they are very much excluded from all the elitarian circles where the real policy was made. Because before going to the assembly, before taking decisions, often you had, of course, to organize yourself and to make alliances and determine the course of the political discourse. So what we see then in the ancient iconography is also that these people who primarily were farmers or craftsmen, like here in the lower image, are depicted also with bodies that do not correspond to the ideal of beauty according to the classical standard. You see, for example, that this craftsman here has lacks some of his hair, which was seen as, of course, non-corresponding to the ideal of youth and beauty in the classical period. So you would never represent a citizen, also an older one, in this fashion. So what we can take from this, I think, is that we have here a blueprint for the separation of the two discourses, which I mentioned in the introduction. On the one hand, we have the political form of this settlement, which is based on the idea of equality to a certain extent, and of urbanity. So people live together in this urban center and they cultivate the area around the city. They do not engage with handicraft production very much. So they somehow depend on the importation of pottery, painted pottery, and metal works. But they all do this because it embodies their political model of a more or less equal community of landowners. So land ownership in the classical period is the only really recognized form of wealth, together with animal husbandry. You can also be a very rich owner of manufacturers or artisan, architect, or whatever, or trade. You can become very rich with trade, but you will not be recognized fully. So there's a social distinction. And so this is very clear in the texts of Plato and Aristotle. The ideal citizen in both Plato and Aristotle shall not be a trader nor an artisan, but he shall live off the land property. And so with this backdrop, we can look at what's happening on the level of theory. And I think it's very interesting to see that there too, there's a shift toward this kind of model. We have two main periods. So 5th to early 4th century, there are class systems. So I label this class systems here. And this is especially Hippodamus of Miletus and also Plato in the Republic. He then changes completely in the laws. And the idea is here that you have society divided into several classes, 2 or 3 or even more, based on Egyptian models also and Near Eastern models. So you have the guardians, who are the warriors, right, and who control also the land, so who are the landowners, and then you have in Plato's case, the philosophers, and then you have also women And so he talks a lot about the role of women in the Republic. So women should also take part in the administration and in the military service of the polis. And kind of the same holds true for Hippodamus, who lived earlier in the 5th century. So the idea that you have a class of artisans who are occupied with production, and then you have farmers, and then you have warriors and so on. So everybody in this society, everything is kind of planned and thought of. And then what we see in the 4th century is kind of surprising if you look at it from this side, because both Plato in the Laws and Aristotle kind of obscure and exclude this other aspects. So in the Laws, Plato, for example, doesn't talk almost nothing about women. He created a scandal by his ideas of women taking part in the polis, and then in the Laws he talks basically only about male citizens who are all landowners. So he keeps the question of who produces pottery and who makes the shoes, which is the beginning of the Republic. So he says, what do we need for a polis, a city, to become reality? And so we need someone who produces food, and we need someone who produces shoes, and someone who looks for, who protects us, and so on. So it's all the division of labor at the beginning. And in the Laws, then it's all about property and being a landowner. And he says actually a citizen of the city should not be engaged in artisanal production, but this should be left to other people who are not citizens. And the same holds true for Aristotle in the Politics, and I shortly like to summarize what he says. So he speaks of classes, but he uses the term mere, so groups inside the city, but he does not specify how these classes are to be created, which was a principal concern of Hippodamus and Plato. So who should be a warrior and who should be the philosopher and the guidance of the city and so on. But he claims that neither tillers of the soil nor artisans and merchants shall be citizens. So who are these people? He doesn't give an answer. So the citizen body of Aristotle's best state, which is a new city, a newly established city, where he tries to exemplify his idea of the ideal city, consists of warriors who own all the land and who alone are worthy to serve also as priests. So they are alone control also the ritual activities. And unlike Plato in the Republic, Aristotle says basically nothing about the role of women in the state. And so women are absent in his ideal city. Of course, he thought that there would be women, but he doesn't talk about their role. And finally, the position and living condition of peasants and those who till the soil, as he says, remain totally obscure. He says, well, the best thing would be that slaves would work the fields owned by the citizens. If this is not possible, then it should be barbaroi perioikoi. So that will be barbarians living in the surroundings, which it doesn't explain. I mean, it is strange to think that Aristotle, who was writing in Greece, wrote about barbarians living in the countryside. I think it somehow shows that he had a colonial setting in mind. And what is important is that who are these barbarians and how they shall be integrated in the polis, it remains totally unclear. It's really a wide spot in the text. So he doesn't say these should be slaves. Who owns these slaves? should they be, formally independent communities who are then exploited by the polis by some form of dependency? Should they continue to live according to their traditions, or should they be deprived of their language and cultural traditions? All this remains open. But at the same time, this is where I'm going to conclude, Aristotle was the one who conceptualized the idea of economics as a separate discourse. And this is basically when we see for the first time what Gayatri Spivak calls the international division of labor. So you have one political discourse talking about rights, and it's very much limited to today to national borders, and in antiquity to the idea of the citizen of the polis. And then you have an economic discourse, which is totally globalized today. So there are almost no national borders. So we are actually connected. Our living conditions in Europe, for example, depend on subaltern laborers in Bangladesh or in other countries. But this has no impact on the political discourse. So we talk about economic justice and equality and relations as something which is separated and which does not appear in the political image of our community. And I think this can be in some way labeled the legacy of this discourse, the structuring of political and economic discourse. And we can also see how this is based on a colonial experience, where we have a city which was formerly independent and equal and organized as an equal community of landowners, citizens, where there was no space for people living in the countryside. There was, of course, space for slaves and people owned by these citizens. But the rural populations we see emerging then in Heraclea and many other places across the Greek world and beyond do not appear in the political discourse. So we don't know whether they were slaves. I don't believe they were all slaves, because they have tombs with grave goods, and there's a certain level also of cultural and economic level, but they are neither really included in the citizenship and political participation, and so they are somehow invisible. And this kind of invisibility is very important to their being subaltern, and they're being also kind of seen as ridiculized and contempted by the urban elites. And what I would like to stress is that we think about classical Greece often as an urban civilization, of course, but in our own research, the invisibility of these populations somehow continues, or is continued, as we focus on urban, elite houses and living standards. So this was an attempt to give a voice to these populations, which is, of course, extremely difficult. And so I'm looking forward to your critique and suggestions and comments. Thank you very much.